your might. Test your might. Test your might. Test your might. Test your might. Scorpion. Fight. Excellent. Get over here! Finish him. Scorpion win. Flawless victory. Fatality. Get over here! Excellent. Come here! Finish him. Scorpion wins. Get over here! Finish her. Scorpion wins. Fatality. Come here! Get over here! Excellent. Finish him. Scorpion wins. Fatality. Come here! Finish her. Scorpion wins. Fatality. Scorpion wins. Flawless victory. Fight! Get over here! Sonya sub Scorpion Luke Raiden Kano Johnny Sonya sub Scorpion Luke Raiden.
some parents think is just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now from Northridge with more on that story. Carol?
Here it is, Bob, behind me. It's called Mortal Kombat, and we're going to talk to Aaron Brandis here about the game. Aaron, how does it work?
Well, basically, you pick a couple characters, you do maneuvers on the joysticks and buttons, you do moves, and
then what are you trying to get to? Fatalities?
Nah, there's a master guy you got to beat at the end. Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart, or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood? How do you feel about cutting his head off? After a $10 million advertising campaign, Mortal Kombat, debuting in home video today, is expected to sell 2 million copies at $50 a pop. A horrifying possibility for parents who can't believe the game makers are fantasizing about decapitation and murder.
I don't think they'll have this at home, no.
You don't think so?
A little bit too violent.
You look a little startled.
Yeah, it's a little too violent, I think.
That's pretty bad. That's just plain gross.
Furthermore, advanced technology allows digitized video of real martial arts actors, making the action look real and not as cartoony. In fact, Mortal Kombat so shocked the managers at a nationwide arcade chain that they tried a sanitized version of the game. Instead of chopping the opponent's head off, he simply disappears. Sales dropped 40%.
They came up and said, what'd you do to the game? It's no fun anymore.
Kids are saying chill out to worried parents.
I think TV, personally, influences more than a video game. A video game is a video game.
The bottom line, parents wonder if kids can separate fantasy from the real thing.
Wait until they get out in a situation where they're fighting, and then they'll think about this and try to make it real.
But you know, game makers are saying that games are going to become more visually violent and more sexually violent as adults buy more video games. I mean, it's a big money market, $50 to $60 a pop. Plus, some of the critics say, or they at least concede, that parents have to be there in order to pay for the game, so at least there's some discretion there. And game makers are also talking about a new rating system similar to the movies. We'll see what happens. I'm Carol Lynn reporting.
Mortal Kombat would probably not have been this kind of success if it wasn't for the blood, the gore and of course the fatalities. The new digitized graphics completely redefined the term realism in the video games back then, and the inclusion of the breathtaking finishing moves did not remain unnoticed among the fans, and also among concerned parents and authorities. The gore was so over the top for the time that it created one of the biggest video game controversies of all time, leading to the creation of the ESRB. Blood, gore and fatalities have become Mortal Kombat's identity ever since. The TV commercial for the home versions was broadcasted at various TV channels. This commercial remained in history as one of the most recognizable video game commercials. Most of the home ports were released on September 13. Also known as Mortal Monday. Mortal Kombat was released on almost every home system, with gameplay similar to the one in Revision 3.0. More recent releases of the game, in Midway Arcade Treasures and Arcade Collection, offer an emulated Arcade T-Unit 4.0 revision. Mortal Kombat quickly became one of the most popular fighting games around the world with its unique fighting system, digitized graphics, secrets, and of course the fatalities.
On Capitol Hill, the focus was on video games, amid complaints that some of them promote the very thing that most people are trying to prevent. Video game manufacturers today issued something of a preemptive strike, aimed at keeping violent and sexual images away from kids. NBC's John Cochran now.
The makers of some video games promote them as a way that guys can show how tough they are. But today, the game makers themselves blinked. Under pressure from an angry Congress and angrier parents, game makers offered a new rating system. GA for general audiences, all ages. MA13, okay for teens, but not younger kids. And MA17 for 17-year-olds and older. The timing of the peace offering was no accident. Just an hour later, the Senate began hearings on new legislation to prevent violent games from reaching kids. Game makers admit ratings won't work unless stores and arcades enforce the new rules.
We can sit here all day and talk about morals, but the reality of the business world out there, and unfortunately in many cases, is driven by economics.
Some makers say playing games with simulated violence may actually help some teenagers who can release pent-up feelings, a theory other witnesses disputed.
How would you like to have a teenage daughter go out on a date with someone who's just watched or played 3 hours of that game?
Not much, said the senators, who vowed to press ahead with tough legislation unless the $6 billion a year video game industry cleans up its act soon. John Cochran, NBC News, Washington.
In the mid-'80s and early '90s, rap went mainstream. MTV came into its own. Cartoons got edgier. But as the entertainment industry pushed the envelope, politicians and advocacy groups pushed back. They wanted to protect children from inappropriate lyrics and images. So music, television, and even video games came under fire. Developed by Midway, it hit arcades in 1992 and was the #1 arcade game that year. But it really gained notoriety in 1993, when Acclaim Entertainment launched a $10 million campaign to celebrate its multi-format release onto the home console scene. Dubbed Mortal Monday, there were sweepstakes and commercials to promote the event. They even played previews in movie theaters. The campaign brought a lot of attention to the game, but it wasn't all good. Suddenly, a lot more people were aware of the game's violent content. Sega's version was much more graphic than Nintendo's. By putting in a code, players could unlock blood during combat. Sega also kept in the gruesome finishing moves. You can decapitate an enemy and watch their spinal cord dangle, or rip an opponent's heart out of his chest. Meanwhile, Nintendo replaced all the blood with sweat and toned down the finishing moves. As a result, Sega's version easily outsold Nintendo's. Some video game companies tried to mitigate the problem. Nintendo had strict content policies, and they'd been in place for a while. They put limits on things like graphic depictions of death, sexual content, and profanity, which explains why their version of Mortal Kombat was less graphic than Sega's. For their part, Sega actually had its own rating system. Sega's Video Game Rating Council divided its games among 3 age-based categories: GA for general audiences, MA13 for mature audiences, and MA17 for adults. Mortal Kombat was rated MA13. Sega introduced the ratings in the spring of 1993, after getting heat for the graphic games being released on their consoles. They also publicly encouraged other video game companies to rate their games as well. The suggestion infuriated Nintendo. They didn't buy the idea that Sega created its rating system as a way to inform parents and protect children. Peter Main, Nintendo's marketing director, accused Sega of throwing up, quote, smoke screens to justify the marketing of increasingly violent games. Nintendo also suggested that rating a game like Night Trap MA17 actually made it more appealing to young kids. But regardless of Sega's motives, the ratings didn't hold much clout. A lot of customers didn't even know about the ratings, and the ones who did found the 3-category system too vague to be helpful. But many questioned whether government intervention was the answer. They didn't want children to be harmed, but they didn't want censorship either. Public concern was growing, and the industry's attempts to police itself weren't working. Then, in late 1993, something totally unremarkable happened. A 9-year-old boy asked his parents for a copy of Mortal Kombat. They almost gave it to him, until the boy's father did some research on the game and became upset with what he saw. In fact, Bill Anderson was so upset that he discussed it with his boss, Senator Joe Lieberman. And that's where this story gets a lot more remarkable. Senator Lieberman was alarmed by what he heard, so he did something about it. Just in time for the 1993 holiday buying season, Senators Lieberman and Herb Kohl spearheaded a joint congressional hearing on violence in video games. They proposed legislation calling for a rating system that would help buyers gauge a game's violence and sexual content. The senators were clear that they wanted the video game industry to create its own independent rating system, but that if they refused, the government would step in. Not everyone liked the idea. Some people called it censorship, and a few maintained that the industry was doing a good job policing itself. The other side was much more skeptical. Many wanted video game producers to just stop making games that featured graphic violence. Others didn't trust the industry at all. And it was that environment of distrust, concern, and a demand for change that heaped so much attention on the heated congressional hearings. During the hearing, a packed crowd watched the most violent portions of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. One might expect that the video game industry panelists would be equally united. After all, they were on the same side, right? The atmosphere changed when the video game leaders testified. As representatives from Sega and Nintendo scrambled for moral high ground, they turned on one another. Remember, Sega had its own rating system, but it was vague, and the general public didn't know much about it. Nintendo had the real advantage. Thanks to their guidelines, their version of Mortal Kombat was more family-friendly than Sega's version, and, as they were quick to point out, they had nothing to do with Night Trap. Lincoln's testimony was polished. He spoke with confidence. He admitted that Nintendo wasn't perfect, but maintained that it had, and always would, make an effort to create fun, appropriate games. Their games would never feature gratuitous sex or violence because Nintendo's own guidelines wouldn't permit it. In a clear dig at Sega, he stated that Night Trap, quote, simply has no place in our society. None of this let Nintendo off the hook. Bill White. He looked less comfortable than Lincoln. He occasionally stumbled over his words. He came across as defensive, and with good reason. Sega produced more graphic games than Nintendo, and it was clear to Bill White that he was in the hot seat. White's main point was that video games weren't just for children. He pointed out that the average Sega CD user was 22 years old, and that the average Sega Genesis user was 19 years old. He argued that adults played video games too, and that over time, the industry would attract more players of all ages. Although White made some good points, he was in an unenviable position. Senator Byron Dorgan pressed Bill White on the rating system age categories.
And do you view those over the age of 13 as mature?
There's three designations that the Independent Rating Council chooses to designate the product. It's MA13, appropriate for teenagers and older, but not for young children with parental.
But doesn't have the word mature attached to that?
Yes, I believe it does.
And so the presumption is those over 13 years of age are mature?
Yes.
Are you kidding me?
With parental discretion. I'm referring now to...
What are you thinking about?
The MA13 titles.
The senators even tried to use Sega's own policies against them.
As always, Sega will not approve products which contain A1, material that encourages criminality of any kind.
Lieberman argued that Sega was marketing its mature and adult games to children. He proved his point using a Sega pamphlet, which contained a blurb on Night Trap, alongside blurbs for children's games, with nothing to distinguish the games for adults from the games for kids. He drove the point home a moment later when he played a Sega commercial for Mortal Kombat. According to Sega's own rating system, the game was inappropriate for children under 13. But Lieberman said that the hero of the commercial looked under 13, and that the ad seemed clearly geared toward children. But no one shut Sega down quite as hard or as effectively as Nintendo's Howard Lincoln.
Let me make just a couple of other points. I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been, and Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do. Furthermore, I can't let you sit here and buy this nonsense that this Sega Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults. The fact of the matter is, this is a copy of the packaging. There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do. When they started getting heat about this game, then they adopted the rating system and put ratings on it. But today, just as I'm sitting here, you can go into a Toys R Us store or a Walmart or a Kmart, and you know as well as I do that you can buy this product, and no one, certainly no sales clerk at retail, is going to challenge you.
The congressional hearing made a public spectacle out of the console wars, but it did more than just bruise the egos of the industry leaders. It also got them to publicly agree to, and move forward with, a rating system.
The best thing you can do, not only for this country, but for yourselves, is to self-regulate. And believe me, it's not only going to be important to our kids, it's going to be important to the ultimate credibility and success of your business.
The congressional hearing drew a lot of attention from the media. Suddenly, the most violent portions of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were common knowledge. Some people didn't like what they saw. On February 3rd, 1994, just a few months after the December hearing, Senators Lieberman and Cole introduced the Video Game Rating Act of 1994. The bill would allow the government to create a 5-member commission, appointed by the President of the United States, that would help the industry create a rating system. The industry was given a deadline of just 1 year to pull together or face government intervention. But working together was easier said than done. The Senate hearing had been rough. At times, it was just plain embarrassing. Nintendo and Sega had always been vicious competitors, but their battle during the hearing took their animosity to another level. That spring, the anger boiled over once again. It started with a news report which revealed that Nintendo had provided a congressional committee with a tape of the most violent portions of Night Trap prior to the December hearing. Sega of America President Tom Kalinske spoke out via a press release. "I'm really amazed that Nintendo would so irresponsibly drag retailers and the entire video game industry through the mud in their efforts to slow our momentum. But if Nintendo was supposed to feel ashamed, it didn't work. Sega may have been thrown under the bus, but Nintendo thought they deserved it. Nintendo felt that none of this, the public outrage, the government intervention, would have happened if Sega had just kept graphic violence out of their games." Sega and Nintendo would never get along, but if there was one thing they disliked more than each other, it was the thought of government intervention. During the follow-up congressional hearings in March of 1994, Jack Heistand of the newly formed Industry Rating Council announced that 7 companies, including Sega and Nintendo, would comply with a rating system, just in time for the holiday season. What's more, the ratings wouldn't just appear on a game's packaging. The groups agreed to include ratings in ads and other marketing material. They committed to a customer and retailer education campaign and promised to make the ratings easy for customers to understand. They said that the ratings board would be independent, and that they'd seek public input as they finalized their guidelines and ratings categories. They also stated that there would be tough sanctions for any company that got a rating fraudulently, by, for example, withholding critical information. But they stood firm on some issues. Jack Heistand told the senators that the ratings board wouldn't be in the business of regulating game content. In other words, they would give customers information about a game, but they wouldn't tell software developers what to include or remove from a game. When Senator Lieberman asked about going back and rating all previously published games, the group stood firm once again.
In total, there are probably 4,000 or 5,000 titles in the marketplace today, and there are 50,000 retail outlets. For us to try and go back and rate those products, sticker all those products, would put such a burden on accomplishing what we're trying to do for the next 6 months. It's virtually impossible.
The fact that so many video game companies were working together on a rating system was significant. Together, the companies accounted for 60% of video game sales. But the senators wondered whether that was enough.
As I understood you to say, or perhaps you can enlighten us, you do not or you cannot say today that you represent the entire industry.
That's correct.
So isn't that going to be a problem that needs to be addressed successfully before, again, as we move towards the route, toward what our goal is, which is to assure the American people that we have resolved the problem?
Absolutely.
Isn't that a problem that needs to be addressed?
The group was powerful, but they couldn't do it alone. After all, what would stop some other video game company, one that wasn't part of the group, from making its own unrated games? In a word, money. Everyone knew that there needed to be some sort of financial disincentive for companies that wanted to sell unrated games. Going around the rating system would have to be not just morally irresponsible, but financially irresponsible. They needed help from the biggest names in retail. And they got it.
Upon implementation of an industry-wide rating system, Walmart will only purchase video games that have gone through the rating process and received a rating. Thank you.
Mr. Kirby, by congressional standards, that was an unusually short statement, but I would add it was unusually significant, and I appreciate it very much.
Once the industry-wide rating system is established, Toys R Us would also only purchase rated games. Thank you.
We're on a roll. That's great. Thank you.
With the support of major retailers and the main players in the video game industry, the rating system moved forward. When they reconvened in July, the Industry Ratings Council had a new name, the Interactive Digital Software Association. They had more video game companies on board too. What started less than a year before as outrage over violent games was quickly working toward a resolution. At first, Sega pitched that the IDSA use their rating system, but Nintendo disagreed. The idea of using a competitor's rating system on their products was too much, and as many people outside the industry had pointed out, Sega's rating system was vague and otherwise flawed. So the group agreed on an entirely new rating system. And so, the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, was born. The independent group came up with 5 categories to rate games, based on help from parents, researchers, and child development experts. Early childhood, kids to adults, teen, mature, and adults only. This also included 17 content descriptors. Developers had to pay a fee and send a videotape of pertinent content to get their game rated by the ESRB. While this was all voluntary, the console makers could refuse a title if it wasn't rated. Just as they promised it would, the ESRB began rating games prior to the 1994 holiday season. And it couldn't have come at a better time. During the July hearing, Senator Lieberman said that violence in video games wasn't going away. As proof, he disgustedly shared details of a new first-person shooter called Doom. Overall, the senators were pleased with the ESRB. They wanted the industry to regulate itself, and it had. In response, Senators Lieberman and Cole shelved the Video Game Rating Act of 1994.